it's a great honor to be part of this education series. I feel particularly, given the seniority of so many of my colleagues who have been teaching about this, I feel particularly humbled and honored to be invited to be part of this. And so I'm going to begin with a apology to begin with. I'm not a Leo Baeck scholar, and I assume that I've been asked to give this talk, partly, as I said, because of my, because of what Alex said, because I have the word doctor in front of my name and rabbi as well, and that I did my PhD in intellectual history and meaning the kind of the history of ideas. And secondly, because of my position, as Alex mentioned, as one of the present rabbis at Eilith Synagogue, the community in London in which Leo Baeck found a home after the war, and where he was president of the synagogue. And I, in fact, have behind me our Eilith picture of Leo Baeck, which will soon hang in our new building. It was hanging in the old building. It will now be in the new building once we've found exactly where we want it to go. And it says underneath, Rabbi Dr Leo Baeck, President 1951 to 1956. And there are those in the community who still remember him in this role, and as the person who would often bless the congregation at the end of services. So I'm not a Leo Baeck scholar, and I haven't read everything by him, and I certainly haven't read everything by him in the original German. And as we're going to see, understanding him in his turn-of-the-century German context is going to be very important in understanding some of his more important intellectual contributions. So before we go any further, I want to signal my gratitude for two very important books that I have relied very heavily on in my preparation for this talk. The first is this one here, Leo Baeck, Teacher of Teresin, published in 1968 by Rabbi Dr Albert Friedlander, who was an acolyte of Baeck's and who was a prominent teacher at Leo Baeck College and rabbi at Westminster Synagogue. And this is an explication of Baeck's writings. Though it begins with a chapter on the life of Leo Baeck, Friedlander says, perhaps too modestly in his introduction, that a full-length biography is vitally needed. And therefore it's perhaps ironic that what then appeared just about 4 years ago, this book by Michael Mayer, Rabbi Leo Baeck, Living a Religious Imperative in Troubled Times, describes Friedlander's book as the first biographical work. But actually this is a much fuller biographical work, covering much more detail about Baeck's life, although not as much of his intellectual output. So between them, these two books give you a great view of Baeck's life and his writings, and much more than I will give you today, especially going into his letters and his archival material. So in outline, what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to begin with a summary of Baeck's life. I'm going to give it an overview. My instinct is always to go into too much detail, as I did in preparing for this talk. So I often lose myself in the weeds. But I'm going to try and focus on just one text that Baeck wrote, but probably his most famous philosophical/theological work, which is called The Essence of Judaism, which he published in 1905. So in order to understand what he's doing in that work, my training as an intellectual historian requires that we try to understand not just what he says, but that we try to understand the context out of which he wrote it and who he was responding to. And I'm going to try to understand what was, according to Baeck, the essence of Judaism. And finally, I'm going to ruminate a bit on what that means for us in our current context today. So that is Rabbi Leo Baeck. A slightly different picture to this one, but you can see kind of the essence of him in that. Leo Baeck's father, Samuel Baeck, was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Lissa, a border town between Germany and Poland. And Leo Baeck, was born there on the 23rd of May, 1873. And as a town, Lissa had a somewhat distinguished history, having been the home to Rabbi Akiva Eger, who came to the town in 1781 and who founded the yeshiva there and was head of the yeshiva. And you can still find Eger's commentary printed on the inside of the Shulchan Aruch, the great code of Jewish law, so we know that he was an influential halachic authority. And Albert Friedlander points out that living in a border town can be defining for someone growing up there because it gives one experiences of different cultures. It also potentially creates difficulties because of conflicts between Polish and German that Baeck would have encountered as a child and as a teenager. The other thing that, of course, defines Baeck would have been his upbringing in a religious Jewish household, one that was dedicated to Judaism and particularly to the study of Talmud and to Midrash, which he never lost enthusiasm for. But at the age of 17, Baeck went to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau. Now, Breslau was not a progressive seminary in the way we might think today, but it was a break with traditional Judaism in the sense that the curriculum was dominated by what was called Wissenschaft des Judentums, the scientific study of Judaism. The science of Judaism was pioneered by figures such as Leopold Zuntz and by Abraham Geiger, who died just the year after Leo Baeck himself was born. And Geiger is considered very much the founder of Reform Judaism in Europe in many ways. And this study of Judaism, this Wissenschaft, reflected the desire to understand Judaism in a systematic and scientific way, as a creed that could be understood systematically, a bit like the natural sciences had become to be understood systematically. And part of the aim was also what is called apologetic. As we'll see, this was a discipline that Baeck himself was very much a part of, and it was apologetic in the sense that it attempted to promote the position of Judaism in a Christian world, to try to persuade Christians and also some Jews that Judaism was not simply a religion that was defined by the Old Testament, but which continued to develop with rabbinic literature and liturgy and philosophy, and that it was a living, breathing tradition and civilization that people could be proud of. Another of Baeck's teachers would have been, at the Jewish Theological Seminary, would have been Heinrich Gretz, whose historical approach to Judaism Baeck probably didn't agree with, and we'll see how Baeck found a way to think about Jewish theology outside the frame of history, hopefully later if we have some time. Baeck's favourite teacher was his Talmud teacher, Rabbi Israel Levi, whose work on the Talmud became a cornerstone of the study of rabbinic literature at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And so Baeck studied in Breslau for 3 years before moving to Berlin to study at the Lehranstalt. Now, this was where Abraham Geiger had taught until his death and really did represent the liberal Judaism to which Geiger had aspired, and whereas the Jewish Theological Seminary had been more conservative. And here, Baeck studied with Zygmunt Maybaum, the prominent anti-Zionist rabbi, and also uncle to Rabbi Ignaz Maybaum. So those who were at Rabbi Mark Goldsmith's talk on Maybaum will have heard already about the Lehranstalt quite a bit. So he studied at the Lehranstalt, but he also in Berlin studied at another institution which had an equally important, I would say, influence on Baeck's life, which was that of the University of Berlin. And prominent among his teachers there was the philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey. It was from Dilthey that Baeck gained a kind of structure in which to understand the Jewish religion in an examination of inner psychology. So rather than simply through the external events of history or through the imposition of doctrine and dogma, Baeck was able to understand history from within. Dilthey supervised Baeck's PhD thesis, which was another connection perhaps to my giving this lecture, which is that Baeck's PhD thesis was in intellectual history. He looked at the early response in Germany to the philosophy of Benedict Spinoza, that famous Jewish philosopher who was excommunicated by his community in Amsterdam because he was considered to be heretical in the philosophy that he had espoused. And another thing to note about Dilthey in terms of how he affected Baeck's work was that he was committed to differentiating the humanities from the natural sciences. So perhaps an indication that Judaism had to be understood differently to the way it had by those who pursued the Wissenschaft. Perhaps more attention had to be given to psychology, so what was going on in people's heads, rather than simply the external or the kind of categorical reasoned imperatives that came with philosophy, and more of that later. We also find in his PhD something that Friedlander points us to, which is that it's in his PhD that Baeck already begins to formulate a particular form of critique about the Christian Germany in which he was his thought was developing, and particularly Northern German Lutheran theology. He says, and we'll come back to this a bit later, in their strife with the spiritual world, the reformers had found protection given them by the worldly sword, and grateful for this, they ever preached, be subservient to the authority. So we'll come back to that, but that's worth noting that already in his PhD, Baeck was pushing back against a certain type of Lutheran theology that would require people to submit to secular authorities without thinking too much about what their religious imperatives were asking them to do. It's also important to say that the choice of choosing Spinoza as his topic to study for his PhD gives us a sense already of where Baeck was going. And Mayer points out that Beck's decision to focus on Spinoza perhaps already shows him to be choosing the less conventional path, Spinoza having been excommunicated by his community. He finished his PhD in 1895, and then he spent a couple of years writing. And already we can see in that writing some of his early ideas that would then blossom in the Essence of Judaism, which we're going to come to in a moment. Particularly his ideas that set Judaism against dogma and against being a static and unchanging tradition. In 1897, Baeck was ordained as a rabbi, and he became the first rabbi of a new synagogue in Oppeln, then in Germany, but again now in Poland. And it was there that he met Natalie Hamburger. They married, and their daughter Ruth was born in 1900. There isn't much that's known about Natalie, or I couldn't find a huge amount about her and the role she played. Apart from that, she was really a traditional Rebbitzin. She supported him. She played a very traditional role of, as a rabbi's wife, and sadly died in 1937, before the most turbulent times in Baeck's life, when he became the leader of the Jewish community in Nazi Germany. And one can only imagine how difficult that was for him and how much it compounded the difficulties of those times, having been married for 40 years and then to be left without his partner and support. In his period in Oppeln, to go back to the late 1890s, it doesn't seem that Baeck was particularly successful as a preacher. He was very softly spoken, he was very intellectual, and it seems like his audience wanted something a bit more sentimental, a bit more sweet maybe, and a bit less challenging. But it did give him the chance to think and to read and to write. And it was in this period that he wrote the book that we're going to come on to in a second, The Essence of Judaism. In this period also, he showed himself to be, again, running against convention. And this happens in two particular ways, which are both discussed at length by Michael Mayer in his book. One of which is that he opposed many of the others in his rabbinical assembly, his rabbinical association, by refusing to oppose Zionist meeting in Germany. So all the other rabbis in his association, apart from one Orthodox rabbi, opposed the meeting of the Zionist Congress in Munich. because they felt that it undermined their commitment to Germany and their loyalty to Germany. Baeck, on the other hand, was much more tolerant of Zionism and was willing to see those Jews who were Zionist as a legitimate expression of their Judaism. The other suggestion that he made that made him a bit of an outlier was he made an impassioned speech about how important it was and how much he valued the fact that he'd studied in two different rabbinical seminaries. So first of all, he'd studied in Breslau and then in Berlin, first in a conservative seminary and then in a progressive one. And he really advocated that because it meant seeing things from different perspectives, learning more in different ways. But I think the other rabbis thought that he was just a bit ridiculous and didn't really acknowledge that that was a great thing to do. In 1907, having written The Essence of Judaism, again, we're going to come back to that in a second, he moved to be rabbi in Dusseldorf, and then in 1912 to Berlin, where he served as one of the rabbis of the community in Berlin, a very large community, both serving as a rabbi, also teaching at the Lehranstalt. And it was there also that Baeck was given a bit more freedom than the other rabbis. He had some of his day-to-day roles kind of taken away from him so that he could concentrate more on thinking and reading and writing. The peace of that time only lasted a couple of years before war broke out in 1914, and Baeck volunteered as an army chaplain serving in both the Eastern and the Western fronts. There is a picture of him as an army chaplain, but many of these pictures that I've scanned in from the book are quite pale and not really well defined, so I haven't put too many of them in. But I think there is one here you can see of him as an army chaplain. It was part of this experience that caused Baeck to begin to see that Judaism had a leading role to play in healing the world from this cataclysmic war. And Michael Mayer argues that it was in this war that Baeck saw a struggle between, as I mentioned before, the Lutheran adherence to obeying state power versus the appeal to the individual conscience that came, he argued, from Calvin, the other great German Christian reformer. Although there was clearly in his writings a sense that the state, not just the Prussian state or the German state, but other states in Europe were responsible for a huge disaster that was the First World War, Baeck didn't criticize his German state directly, but he talks about hoping for a new Europe that would prevent the occurrence of a war like they just experienced. And as such, Baeck served the Weimar Republic as an advisor on Jewish affairs. He was still very much what one might call a Prussian idealist. He wasn't just a German Jew, but a German with a belief in and a desire for the success of the German nation. Hence, he doesn't withdraw from involvement with political thinking or with the thinking about what it means to be German. He's still involved in that thinking of that Lutheran and Calvinist tension that I've just talked about. In the 1920s was a period in which Baeck was incredibly productive, but also in which he clearly became a leader of the Jewish community in Germany. He became head of the Allgemeine Deutsche Rabbinerverband, and he became head of B'nai Brit. Everything changed, however, in 1933 with the ascent of Hitler and Nazism, and we know that history, the way in which the Nuremberg laws demoted Jews to the status of second-class citizens. The community now had to form a representative body of Jews in Germany, which needed a head to represent them. This was a community that had many eminent people who could have represented them and negotiated with the Nazi authorities on their behalf. So we may ask the question, why did they choose Leo Baeck? Well, one of his colleagues, Bruno Italiener, says They chose their greatest rabbi. For with that sense of the future which long suffering seems to have bred within Jews, they felt that this time of need required a man who would not only strive to meet the archenemy with the weapons of worldly wisdom. It had to be a man wearing the armour the prophets wore, when in the name of the just and holy God they called the rulers of their time to battle within the lists. A man who drew his full strength out of his living, believing God, out of his impassioned love for the Jewish people. We're going to see some of that, where that idea about Baeck comes from when we read his work in a moment. It was through negotiation and real political bargaining that Baeck was able to gain time for the people to reorganize and to help each other in these new dire conditions. And of course, there are some who, in the last 80 years, have seen Baeck's actions as having been a form of collaboration with the Nazis. But the time he and others on the representative bought for the community was possibly all that could be done. They did not have the freedom to resist. And I'll come back again to this question of what it means to resist political authority at the end. Finally, he could have left Germany at this point. Many people did. He had the opportunity to, but he decided to remain to support his community. And in 1943, Baeck was sent to Teresin or Theresienstadt, described by many as the model concentration camp, which the Nazis liked to show outsiders as an example of how well the Jews were being treated. This was obviously not how Baeck and other inmates experienced it. When people talk about Baeck as enacting a spiritual resistance, I think what they're referring to is the way in which in the camp, in those darkest of places and bleakest of times, he refused to allow his humanity to be pulled down to that level. And he spent much of his time in between the grueling manual labour that they had him do. By this point, he was in his 60s, lecturing other inmates in the philosophy of Plato and Kant. He continued to be an idealist, to want to elevate the soul and the intellect, as was his calling as a rabbi. And Rabbi Tony Hammond, in his short biography of Baeck, says, "This rabbi, community leader, scholar and teacher came to be a heroic figure, setting an example of spiritual resistance and personal courage, living out in a dark time the values he taught in his writings." The Teresin camp was liberated in May 1945, and Baeck had survived. And supposedly his survival was in the end because of an accident. I don't know where this story comes from. We know there were a number of transportations of Jews from Teresin to extermination camps throughout the 1940s. And the story, which is cited in fact, Rabbi Tony Bayfield's book, most recent book, but I don't know exactly where it's from, is that there was another rabbi called Baeck who was mistaken for Leo Baeck, who was taken instead to one of the extermination camps. Baeck spent the last 11 years of his life after Teresin moving between London, New York, and Cincinnati. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Baeck became the president of Eilith Synagogue, which had been founded largely by German refugees in the 1930s. And in preparing for this talk, I spoke to a member of the synagogue who had met Baeck on Yom Kippur in the year of his death and described the experience as of a much understated man. He said, "You would not have thought that this was the great leading light of liberal Judaism in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. He was very humble and understated." In his travels to New York, Baeck lectured at the Jewish Institute of Religion, which is now merged with the Hebrew Union College, and was presented with an honorary degree by the Jewish Theological Seminary of New York, sponsored by his former student from the Lehranstalt, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And in Cincinnati, Baeck taught students at the Hebrew Union College. He did continue to go back to Germany, unlike many of his contemporaries, and he also visited Israel And like his contemporary and fellow philosopher Martin Buber, Baeck was troubled by the effect that the founding of a Jewish state was having upon the Palestinian population. With a number of other British Jews, Baeck founded the Jewish Society for Human Service, which aimed to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinians. Among those who joined him in this was the lawyer and academic Norman Bentwich, who was also president of ALITH from 1958 to 1971. When he died, there were, of course, many tributes, and I'm particularly grateful to David Jacobs, who is on this session, who is here, for providing a copy of the Synagogue Review from December 1956, the year of Baeck's death, but also the year on which the Leo Baeck College was founded. One of those tributes printed, I think, links us nicely into a consideration of Baeck's philosophy. This is from Rabbi Ignaz Maybaum. He says, Leo Baeck personified a synthesis of two worlds, Jewish tradition and Western civilization. His work and his life are proof that this synthesis is possible. He was a scholar whom any university would have been proud to have as a teacher. And he was a rabbi rooted in the world of Jewish books, old and modern. As a rabbi too, he embodied two worlds, the prophetic messianic side of Judaism and Jewish mysticism were both equally subjects of his study. Especially in the years 1933 to 1939, he lectured on Kabbalistic literature to his students in Berlin. In his sermons, the words Gebot, commandment, and Geheimnis, mystery, were both frequently heard. He was neither a rationalist nor a romantic. He had the scholarly passion for logical exposition of historical facts, and he shared with the romantics the gift to see in the historical events what lies deep beneath the surface. So from those words of Rabbi Maybaum, we see at the center of what Baeck says is the essence of Judaism is a series of dichotomies. Another, of commandment and mystery together, of the knowability and the unknowability of God as far away and God as nearby. And in this next section, I'm going to focus on Baeck's most famous book, The Essence of Judaism, originally, as I said, written in 1905, but substantially expanded for the second edition in 1922. And I think we can see where the war would have come into this and affected him, the First World War. And it's this later edition that people usually refer to, and that's the one that I've been reading. And this is my copy that comes from the ALITH library. But you should be able to get it in any good library or online. I need to begin the study of the essence of Judaism by discussing a different book. So as I mentioned, my background is in intellectual history, and particularly what has been called the contextualist school of intellectual history, meaning that in order to understand a particular thinker or a particular idea or ideology, one has to understand what it is that a person is doing by writing. So I'm going to begin by asking the question, what intervention was Baeck making by writing The Essence of Judaism? And I did start to answer that above, but here is some more detail. The story begins, I think as we've already seen, in German Protestant theology. And in 1899 to 1900, probably the world's most influential Protestant theologian, Adolf von Harnack, gave a series of lectures at the University of Berlin where he was the rector. And Harnack came from a North German Lutheran tradition. And I would also say at this point, there's a great lecture on Harnack's thought and particularly its political implications, which was given by former Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, which I would definitely recommend, though Williams is very interestingly, completely silent on the interaction with Leo Baeck. One of the things that Harnack is now most famous for, or perhaps infamous for, is that he was one of the signatories to the Manifesto of the 93 in 1914, which was a spirited defense of the German war effort, particularly in the face of accusations of German atrocities in the destruction of the Belgian city of Louvain in September of that year. It was at this point that possibly the other great Protestant theologian of the period, Karl Barth, moved away from von Harnack as his teacher. Harnack wanted to strip away all the dogma that had accrued around Christian theology due to the influence, as he saw it, of Hellenistic philosophy, of Greek philosophy. He saw that the Reformation, started by people like Luther and Calvin in the 16th century, as the beginning of a process of stripping away all those dogmas and rituals by removing things like priestly indulgences, the seven sacraments, and he was keen to bring that process to a final fulfillment. And he previously published a multi-volume work on the history of dogma. So what was the essence of Christianity according to Harnack? That essence that began with Jesus, but which had accrued all these other things that got in the way of understanding it, all these philosophical ideas that we didn't need. Well, he says they are three things: the fatherhood of God, the infinite worth of the human soul, and the ethical ideal of the kingdom of God. Importantly, all of these are inward and private. This is a kingdom of God for Harnack that can be brought about on earth through each individual human being transforming themselves inwardly. Baeck responded to Harnack with a detailed review and critique, and Baeck's primary critique of Harnack's work was that he was dressing up what Baeck saw as apologetic, remember we talked about that before, in the guise of history. In other words, Harnack said that what he was doing was uncovering exactly what Jesus had said and done, when in fact he was being highly selective in his reading in order to get the outcome he wanted. And at least one reviewer said that Harnack was looking down the well to see the water at the bottom of the well, but instead of seeing God at the bottom of the well, saw simply his own reflection being reflected back at him. And Baeck himself reflected that Harnack should have called his book My Christianity rather than the Essence of Christianity. For Baeck, the crucial effect of Harnack's selective reading was to purposefully erase the Jewishness of Jesus. It doesn't seem that Baeck thought of Harnack as anti-Semitic, and in his lecture on Harnack, Rowan Williams also notes Harnack's dismay and opposition to the anti-Semitism of Germany in the 1920s. And we also know that Leo Baeck wrote warmly to Harnack's widow on his death in 1930. So their disagreement really was a scholarly one. It's ironic, perhaps, having accused Harnack of apologetic disguised as history, that what Baeck publishes just a few years later in his The Essence of Judaism is itself very much an apologetic. As Friedlander writes, both works share the language and thought of the turn of the century. Both emphasize the ethical act as the center of religious life and draw away from religious metaphysics. Both of them are trying to deny the idea that dogma and ritual are the things that are most core to religious life, and really want to avoid philosophical thinking about metaphysics. They really want to focus on ethics. The other thing to say is that it's clear that seeking the essence of things was part of the zeitgeist. And as I'm about to mention, Baeck's other teacher that I mentioned before, Wilhelm Dilthey, wrote a book about the essence of philosophy in the same period. So looking for essences of things is clearly very popular, very much part of the zeitgeist. So, having established that that is what Baeck is responding to, let's move on to have a look at the Essence of Judaism, this book that Baeck wrote just a few years after the Essence of Christianity. So it's also worth mentioning a couple of thinkers who were positive influences on Baeck, not just the people he was responding to, one of whom was Hermann Cohen. Hermann Cohen was a thinker whose thought was probably foundational to Baeck's thinking, but also to the thinking of Martin Buber and Hans Rosenzweig. And Cohen was what's called a neo-Kantian, whose most famous work tells us a bit about the kind of philosopher he was. It was called Religion of Reason out of the Sources of Judaism. So Cohen aimed, like the philosopher he's most influenced by, Immanuel Kant, for a systematic ethics that was based on reason and on the categorical imperative. So a quick note on what the categorical imperative is. It's the fundamental principle of moral philosophy that says that individuals need to act only according to maxims that can be universally applied as a law for all rational beings. So if something is morally right for me to do, it must also be morally right for you to do. And it emphasizes the duty and moral necessity, requiring actions to be guided by principles that respect the inherent dignity and autonomy of all individuals, regardless of personal desires or consequences. And we're going to see how Kant, through Cohen, was clearly a great influence on Baeck. In particular, when we think, for example, and I'll quote, of Baeck's assertion that the peculiar prophetic spirit of Judaism expresses itself in its categorical religious demand that man make decisions. So that seems to be Kant's influence and Cohen's influence. The other person I want to bring back to our attention, however, is Wilhelm Dilthey, who had supervised Baeck's doctoral dissertation, as we talked about. And Dilthey also came out of a Kantian tradition, but a Kantian tradition that was much more critical, I would say, and really emphasized the importance of lived experience and what the German philosophers called Verstehen. He emphasized the unique place of the humanities, as I said, and of the need to approach the texts of the past on their own terms. And we see, therefore, the importance of Dilthey's influence on Baeck when he says things like the fact that the sacrificial service was a limiting factor of the understanding of atonement, since it externalized what should be eternal. So Baeck criticizes, but says that the temple service, the sacrificial cult of the temple, was a necessary historical step that needed to be taken in order to teach human beings about atonement, but it itself didn't ultimately represent atonement as in an ideal way, but it was historically important. And as I said, Dilthey also published his own Essence book, his Essence of Philosophy, in 1907. So I want to now take us through, having set up some of that context, what Baeck is responding to and what Baeck is taking with him forward from these two big philosophical influences. I'm going to delve into some of the things that Baeck teaches in his Essence of Judaism. I'm not going to be able to get through all of them. I realize I've probably talked more about his life than I was expecting to. This is how he begins the Essence of Judaism. He says, during the thousands of years of its history, Judaism has learned and experienced a good deal. In its people, the commanding urge to think further, to struggle with ideas, has persisted through the centuries. Whether by choice or compulsion, Jews have taken many and diverse roads in this world, and their experiences have become part of the total experience of Judaism. Through its people scattered over the world, Judaism has been able to receive the impact of the spiritual experiences of human civilization. And he goes on. With its wanderings, Judaism has undergone changes. Its very destiny has been shaped by the fluctuations of its history. A rich variety of phenomena is found in that history. Not all of these are of equal value or scope. For life, unable to maintain a constant level, has its rises and falls. What is most characteristic of a people is best found in the highest levels of its history, so long as these levels are reached again and again. In this undulating movement from historical peak to peak, the essence of a people's consciousness, what is achieved and preserved, is manifested. Such constancy, such essence, Judaism does possess, despite the shifting phases of its long history. Because of the persistence of that essence, all phases have something in common. The consciousness of possessing a world of their own, a binding spiritual kinship, has always remained alive for the Jews. They all live in one religious home. So that's really the opening of his Essence of Judaism. And it goes on like that. It's got a very philosophical approach. He does quote things as well, but really it's his own words that guide us through what is the essence of Judaism. And it's important here to note this idea of the peaks, that at its high points, Judaism articulated it itself in such a way that maintained a certain essence of Judaism which remained the same throughout. So he's doing the same operation as von Harnack. He's trying to strip away some of the dogma, some of the rituals, some of the things that people assume must be part of Judaism to really get to an inner core. And the thing that exists at the core is, he argues, or one of the things that exists at that core, is that Judaism, that the dominant form of Judaism always remained that of a religious philosophy of inquiry, a philosophy that produced method rather than system. So when he says he doesn't want dogma, what he's saying is that he doesn't believe Judaism is founded on lots of systems of ideas that everyone has to adhere to, but rather a kind of method of philosophical, theological inquiry. And really, one gets a sense when one reads Baeck that you need to just be open to hearing the ethical command. And that's the thing that is really at the center of his book, is the need for human beings to respond to ethical commandments, which is in the place of dogma. There is no one thing we have to believe in order to be pious. Rather, we need to hear the ethical imperatives of God. And Baeck emphasizes that the moral imperatives he refers to were articulated most profoundly by the Hebrew prophets. And the point that he makes most strongly is that monotheism flows from ethics rather than vice versa. We are compelled to believe in one God because that God is making ethical demands on us, rather than we believe in God and then we decide that we must follow God's ethical laws. In terms of this revelation of the prophets are the first ones who start to articulate these laws, these ethical demands, these ethical commandments. And then Baeck argues the people of Israel, in their very existence, continue to be a kind of revelation. That the constant regeneration of the Jewish people, which changes and develops and evolves, is part of a renewed revelation. And as such, Judaism has a mission. Judaism is a universal religion, and therefore Judaism exists for everyone. And Baeck is not a relativist. It's very important that while we're saying that Baeck is one of our kind of liberal, reform, progressive ancestors, that he's not as pluralistic or as relativistic as perhaps we might find ourselves being today. He believes that Judaism is the truth. But this does not mean, he thinks, that only Jews are saved, but it does mean that Jews have a special mission to teach the world about the truth of things. Baeck is very keen to tell us that Jewish tradition is antithetical to myth, and he says that myth only arises when the ethical is not yet the center of religion, when there is not as yet, and there is as yet no comprehension of the idea that man has to choose his own life. I apologize, Baeck refers to man a lot. Again, it's one of those things which, although he is one of our progressive ancestors, he was not keen as we are to make sure that language was neutralized in terms of its gender. And Baeck describes the process by which human beings accept the ethical command through an acceptance of having been created, and therefore the imperative to be in relation to that which created us. And finally, and this is the point I'm going to finish with, for Baeck, the imperative requires action. religion cannot simply be the religion of the interior. It can't be what Harnack said it was, which was for human beings to be transformed on the inside and for that simply to be seen on the outside. In order to live the ethical life, the life that Baeck thought God was requiring of us, it had to be lived in the world. It had to be externalized through action. What I was really struck by when I was reading Baeck this time around was that for Baeck, Judaism is a religion about love. And recently I gave, in fact on Valentine's Day, I gave a Devartara at Eilith about how it was the day of love and that Judaism was a religion all about love. And I referenced the book that's just come out from the Hadar Institute in New York by Rabbi Shai Held, which is called Judaism is About Love. And he actually says at the beginning of his book, you're going to be really surprised by this, that Judaism is all about love. But actually, reading Leo Baeck, I want to say now, no, this was already there 100 years ago in the book of Leo Baeck. We might be resistant still to this idea that Judaism is about love. And I remember sitting in the Leo Baeck College and talking about God's love and being other people being very skeptical about that love's a Christian thing, love's not a Jewish thing. But absolutely love is there in our tradition, and Leo Baeck is a great exponent of that, because through the knowledge that we are created, we feel God's, according to Baeck, we feel God's love, and we therefore are commanded to love each other. And he goes very far with this. He says even loving the enemy is really, really important. But the last thing I want to do is to focus on what it means to be a religious community in these times in which we find ourselves in relation to the political reality. And we have to go back to that Lutheran Calvinist tension that Baeck referred to at the end of the war. Because we see from the trajectory of von Harnack after the war, as I said, he'd supported the German state in its execution of the First World War, and his thought had basically left, many would argue, had left Lutheran Christianity in Germany highly unprepared for the onset of Nazism. Perhaps people like Barth and the confessing churches did a bit better, but Barth ended up having to go to Switzerland and found a church there. I think it leaves us with the question of whether Baeck's philosophy and his theology prepared us for this political moment. So I wanted to refer us to another work that Baeck wrote, which was on the Pharisees, in which he argues that the Phariseeism carried the decision in a conflict between the community and the state. The community, the Jewish community or the religious community, and the Roman state as under the Pharisees. But I think it's clearly at this point thinking, and it's probably in 1947 that he's writing this, so after the war. He says, it's understandable that the Pharisaic community should have striven to win influence in the state. From old writings, it's clear that these efforts were predominantly directed against achieving authority in the Sanhedrin, towards achieving authority in the Sanhedrin, the highest judicial and administrative body. In any event, this was one of the stakes of the political struggle between the Pharisees and Sadducees. The consideration also influenced conflicts that concerned the theory and practice of law. But it was not only a question of influence and authority, something more serious and profound was involved. Phariseeism was more than an organization. It represented a heroic sense of the mission of the Jewish people. And any heroic mission in which a community finds itself joined necessarily passes beyond the limitations imposed by a state. In the eyes of these men, the struggle for God and his commandments was often a struggle against the commandments of the state. A comparison with periods closer to us in time, above all with Puritanism, makes this clear. The state is always defined by its interests. Pharisaism was a heroic spiritual attempt to locate the leading principle of the state not in its own interests, but in the law of God, the attempt to define the ideal of the state by the community ideal, to build it, as Josephus correctly says, into a theocracy, the rule of God. And Baeck was not averse to the idea of martyrdom. He wasn't averse to the idea that we might put our lives on the line for the things we believe in. In fact, when he says that we have to act for God and for the ethical commandments, That is the highest thing that he thinks one can do. But he says, before you can die for God, you have to live for God. And that is, I think, what he was potentially going through when he decided not to come to the UK, not to martyr himself, not to die at the hands of the Nazis, but to live through Teresin and to continue to enact spiritual resistance by continuing to teach there, by continuing to bring Jewish religion to the people there. But I finish with the question, I don't know the answer to this, whether Baeck's ethical imperative has left us still looking for a theology that helps us to deal with the political reality of our times, whether his ethical imperative is something that we can live up to now, and whether there is anything more we need in order to live through it and in order to overcome some of the challenges that we are living through. I've gone on for much longer than I expected. I'm really sorry. But there is time for questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elliot. That was absolutely wonderful. And I didn't realize either that it was already so late. But do we have time for a couple of questions, Elliot? Are you okay to...
Yeah, of course.
So I'd like to start with a question from Josie, who asks about the liberal Judaism's 3 M's, so Montague, Mattach, and Montefiore. Would Leo Baeck have known them and maybe even worked with them?
Montefiore, I think almost certainly, because I think he wrote in the Synagogue Review that David kindly gave me in tribute of Leo Baeck, I believe. Well, there may have been it may have been a different Montefiore, but he definitely Mr. Montefiore wrote for him. I don't know is the answer whether they interacted, but it's a good question.
Thank you. And Fiona is asking a really interesting question as well about Regina Jonas, who was also in Theresienstadt. And do we know if they met at the time and would have interacted? Or?
I'm pretty sure they would have, but again, I don't know for sure. I would point everyone to, there's a great book called Great Reformed Jewish Thinkers, which was edited by Jonathan Romaine, 2010. There's an essay in that book by Rabbi Debbie Young Summers on Regina Jonas. That's where I would suggest. I only recently saw it, but I haven't read it in a while.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Let's see if we. So Dean asks whether his work was already appraised or questioned in Germany at the time before he came to the UK, and was he already famous, or
Yes, well, before he came, he was the head. He was elected. He was appointed head of this representative council of the Jews. So he was very, very well known, both as a rabbi, but also as someone who had, I suppose, the wisdom of a leader as well as academic smarts.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. This was a really wonderful talk and a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for being here tonight and through the past 8 weeks or so for these talks. Join us again next week, where Rabbi Dr. Charles Middleborough, who's the Dean of Leo Baeck College, will be talking about Rabbi Abraham Geiger. So thank you so much, Elliot.
Thank you.